Skepticism is an important part of Western philosophy. It's about asking questions of things. But is it really about asking questions of everything? It's important to understand exactly what skepticism is and where it comes from and how it was constructed into a coherent philosophy. This is something which comes to us from ancient Greece. The word skeptikos means simply to question. And that's what it's all about, is asking questions. Simple, right? Well, there was another technique that was employed, and that is what we would call kritikos, or being critical, judgment. How do those two come together? I mean, they seem to be polar opposites, but actually they're two sides of the same coin, and they were seen as such in the Socratic way of teaching. Now, the Socratic way of teaching is based on asking questions. It has skepticism and criticism at the heart of it. Indeed, that's how the School of Athens was generally organized. This is a Western concept in origin, but it's not as though it's unknown in the Far East. It's certainly an integral part of Buddhism, asking questions. In fact, it's really interesting because Alexander the Great conquered as far as Afghanistan, and as a result of that, there was a Greek kingdom in Bactria, Afghanistan today, the Greco Bactrian kingdom, which converted to Buddhism. And the exact moment when the Socratic method of asking questions enters Buddhism is recorded in a document called the Milinda Panha, or the Questions of King Menander, the Greek Bactrian king. So this concept of learning by asking questions is well known throughout the world. And it's a very good way to learn, because by asking questions, you are thinking critically. You are making your own observations about the world and then relating them to the rest of the world. It's a subject that's important to you, and that helps you as a student. So, what is important to the student? The teacher isn't just dispensing knowledge as if it was a commodity. No, the teacher, the guru, whatever, is giving you what you want. And so, dialogue, asking questions is important. Well, how does criticism come into that? Very simply, is it a good question? Is one of the most important ways that criticism comes in. And indeed, criticism gives rise to what can be done better. Again, they are two sides of the same coin in the Greek art of Socratic learning. So, how does this come down? Well, I have started this whole series with a series of economic questions, basically. Has money itself broken? Now, this sounds ridiculous. How does money break? In order to establish that point and ask whether or not it's a good question, we need some criticism. We need criticism of the current system, how the current system is failing, and how it has been breaking down for a long period of time, starting with where it came from and how it developed. That criticism supports the skepticism that's inherent in that. Now, skepticism is something which is easily overused. If you look at any set of propaganda these days, it's very, very common for people to say, I'm just asking questions here. Well, are you asking appropriate questions? Is the first thing that I would want to bring. Is this a question which is meaningful? Is it relevant to the topic? That takes some criticism, right? Now, in previous episodes, I talked about personalities. Whenever you're asking questions about personalities, whether the personality is the question or the answer, you're in dangerous territory. Okay, this is where you're really looking at intent. Why does he do this? Because he's a bad person. You see, you almost invariably get into intent when you're dealing with personalities. And certainly, technobabble can make a question something that doesn't really make sense to the moment, or doesn't make sense to either the asker or the answerer, anything. Okay? We have to have a clear line of communication. We have to use relatively small words and talk about ideas, not people. But skepticism and criticism very much go together. Are we being purely critical? Well, that can be an issue as well. It's not as popular to be, per se, critical or be perceived as a critic, but that is what a lot of people do. And this is where I want to go back into one of my flat earth examples. They're my favorite system of, well, something that I think we can all agree is just ridiculous. Um, Asking questions about how the universe comes together is an extremely good thing. In fact, most of the assertions that are made by people who subscribe to flat earth models are really, really interesting. Uh, they have a lot of questions about the atmosphere, or actually, sometimes they come out of statements. But if you think about it, uh, if the Earth was the size of a basketball, the troposphere, the 80% of our atmosphere that we live in, the bottom part of it, is no thicker than a layer of plastic wrap or cling film. Okay? In fact, the dimples on a basketball are significantly taller than Mount Everest. It's really interesting. As questions, what is the nature of our atmosphere? Wonderful stuff. Asserting that it has certain properties that it doesn't is an issue. You see, asking questions is good. Being critical to find out if the questions are good is essential. But when you get into purely criticizing whatever failings there might be of a ball earth or whatever, it gets strange. And this is where we get into what are the limits of being skeptical. Now, if you're not asking the right questions, or you've gone down a line of thought from asking the questions that leads you to a dark place, you have to do what we call a sanity check. And everybody who's an engineer knows about the sanity check. Where anything goes wrong is usually based on the assumptions at the beginning. And you go down a line of thought and you try to solve the problem and see how it goes. But at some point, you need to stop and say, does this make sense? We've gone down this long road. Have we arrived in a place that is not bizarre? For example, with the flat earth, a lot of them have come to question whether or not gravity exists, or gravity as we understand it. Now, actually, there are some really interesting things concerning gravity. How gravity comes down, what it means to us, and so on. It's basically the warping of space-time. There are some really interesting questions embedded in that related to, how many dimensions does our universe actually have? Wow. It's definitely three and a half, actually, for space-time. 3.5 to 4, depending on how you look at it, or more. Not 2. But these are interesting questions. When you start to question whether or not gravity exists, or whether Newtonian mechanics explains anything, that's the sanity check. That should tell you we've gone down a rabbit hole here. There's something wrong with our thinking. And this happens with a lot of economic thought. I've come up with some various ideas, ways of looking at things that just did not pan out. And I can't give you any examples because honestly, they're a little embarrassing and I have just thrown them out of my mind forever. But we all do it, and it's good. If you're really thinking things through, you're going to be wrong. Okay? If you come up with 10 new ideas every day, if one of them is good, you seem brilliant. The thing is that 9 of them are bad, and you have to figure out which ones they are. But this is where skepticism, well, it has limits by itself, and it needs critical thinking. It needs criticism to come back at. Now, I've been presenting some ideas here, and I'm looking forward to all kinds of criticism. In fact, I watch other YouTube channels all the time, looking for alternatives to what we might be talking about. My question has been, is our economic system really set up in a way that encourages what we need for the future? And I have been proposing that basically what we need is a system which is very, very flexible, that encourages the development of skill, because technology is all about skill, and therefore it has to be about people. And it has to be as flexible as possible so that it can change dynamically. High overhead caused by things like debt are a problem, and our current financial system is really based on debt. And I see this as a problem that exacerbates the issues that come with technology itself, which tends to put people out of work and deflate things if you're not keeping an eye on it. See, everything has a yin and a yang. They're not black and white, they're not necessarily opposites, but they have a relationship to each other. Skeptikos and kritikos have a strong relationship to each other. Are we asking the right questions? Do the answers make sense? They feed back and forth. But it is all part of the Socratic method, which is, honestly, I think one of the great gifts of Western civilization. It was picked up in the Eastern world 2,000 years ago, so it's known around the world. It's something that, while it was originally developed in the School of Athens, is well appreciated by many different cultures. But it has to be practiced as a discipline. It is, in and of itself, a skill, a technology. How do you ask questions in a way that is productive, that is useful? A little bit of criticism, a little bit of skepticism, going back and forth is always useful. But skepticism is very, very important in understanding how our world comes together. Being skeptical of people is fine, but in an argument that is based entirely on personality isn't going to get you anywhere. The argument has to be based on an understanding. I mean, the idea of an argument is to get to truth. So using big words and big concepts that you don't really understand isn't going to get you anywhere. Authoritarian governments don't want people to be thinking critically. They don't want people to be asking too many questions. That leads to what? Information that is not controlled. This is how it, well, this is the problem that we have in the world today. Finding information and being able to process it properly requires a healthy dose of skepticism, but it is an art form. It takes practice, and it takes a lot of honesty and self-evaluation. After all, the whole point of skepticism is to arrive at the truth. And before you change the world, you have to change yourself. Before you know the truth of the world, you must know the truth of your own heart. They relate to each other. There is a yin and a yang to everything. Thank you.